Hi, everyone. I'm excited to share this next episode. We're going to be getting into some technical topics. So if you're new to Bitcoin, I've gone ahead and created a really helpful glossary that you can access in the show notes to explain terms like nodes, block size, UTXOs, some things that come up in the show. I hope you find it useful. And now it's time for my next guest. Welcome back to the show. Joining me this week is Gloria Zhao, a Bitcoin core developer. The first time hosting on the show, and I'm so grateful to get to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Gloria.
Thank you so much for having me.
I had the chance to do a little bit of research, and I would love to just start at the very beginning with you because I read that you were born in Silicon Valley, but your parents came here from China and they had sort of a difficult time coming here. And as a first generation immigrant, I feel like we have some things in common. So can you sort of share your backstory?
Yeah, sure. My parents grew up in kind of Cultural Revolution China, and like a lot of immigrants to the United States, they suffered a lot and they worked really hard. And I actually grew up around a lot of other people who were second generation immigrants. And the culture was very much, maybe not culture, but a lot of people's backgrounds were like their parents had these crazy traumatic stories. Or, you know, they had these super high competition like tests. And it's like, oh, if they had scored 1 point lower, then there were like millions of people ready to take their place. And if they hadn't scored that 1 point, then they wouldn't be here. And so kind of being able to see the contrast between how I was raised with a tremendous amount of privilege compared to the people like my cousins, for example, who still live in China or ended up somewhere else. Being able to see that contrast, I think, is really eye-opening for second generation immigrants, and it makes us not take for granted the privileges that we have. And so when I was studying computer science at Berkeley, you know, I was very aware of this, and I was like, okay, I would say it to my friends, like, oh, if we're all studying to like be software engineers to build the future, like it doesn't matter unless we have an idea of what kind of future we want to build. And I think people take the kind of second generation immigrant pressures and they translate it in different ways because they definitely want to use kind of the platform that their parents sacrificed so much to give to them, and they're so grateful for it. And it seems only natural and expected that like, hey, I mean, I have no excuses for not achieving or doing something meaningful with my life. And for me, the format of that was to work on Bitcoin Core after I graduated, which was something that my parents kind of struggled to understand because it's not, it's, you know, I had these like Google, Facebook offers and whatnot. Yeah. And that was really exciting for them. And that was what you were supposed to do, right? As a college student who, you know, went to this school, and that was what people strove for. And to throw that away to like get a grant to work on this open source project with no boss and no, you know, is very strange. But to me, it was like this, you know, I'm wasting my privilege if I just end up working at, you know, a company that scrapes your data and serves you ads.
Yeah, well, and you talked about how the developers that you do work with, there's a core sense of altruism. And I relate to so much that you just said, because a motivating force for me, seeing my parents struggle as much as they did when we first moved to the US, that was my motivator, is to justify their sacrifice because I saw them work so hard and I wanted to help them. And it sounds like you are similar in that way. But I mean, I agree. Like my parents wanted me to become a doctor or a lawyer. And then I'm like, oh, I'm going into media and journalism. And I think even though they were super supportive, I think it broke their heart a little bit. They were worried for me because the biggest thing they wanted for me was economic stability and empowerment, which they didn't have. And you, I think in an interview said that you are really passionate about the problem that Bitcoin solves. So can you talk a little bit more about how this passion sort of relates back to what seems like it's very, very core and deep inside of you from your own story?
I think Bitcoin means something different to a lot of people. I think a lot of us are really passionate about what it is about Bitcoin that brought us here. For me, I was studying computer science, and I joined blockchain at Berkeley. Blockchain, the B word, is not super popular, but at the time, a lot of it was kind of purely academic, like distributed systems and cryptography are really interesting, advanced, computer science topics. And being able to apply that in code is something that a lot of nerds like me really enjoy, is being able to look at cool problems, right? But I think the more that I looked at it at blockchain, I think the more I ended up gravitating towards Bitcoin because of the problems that it solves. We had a bit of a consulting thing at blockchain at Berkeley, where we would do these contracts with companies that wanted us to build POCs. Part of their research innovation lab wanted to grok blockchain, because it's a nascent up and coming technology that they need to prove to the executives that they've played with. And 99% of the time I was like, yeah, you don't need a blockchain, but we'll build one for you, and so I really got tired of that and became really interested, first of all, in privacy preserving technologies, which I think I was very idealistic in college, as you should be, I think, because you can afford to be. And, and so the idea of being able to have censorship resistant payments, and not be financially surveilled all the time, and being able to see actually how money works. I felt like Bitcoin was one of the first kind of potentially big things where it really, really meant something for it to be open source, right? You can't ask the bank why they rejected your bank account. You can't ask, how does monetary policy work? What is it going to be in a year? I think the desire to understand how things work, which I think a lot of people have. I mean, everything in government should be open source, right? It should be known to us. What is this? Where's this money going? How's this decision being made? How is it being funded? And where does it go? And who's going to use it? Who has authority, etc. And that should be the case, but it isn't for some reason. And one of the most magical things about Bitcoin, I think, for me, is that it is one of the only things that you can truly verify fully. And being able to do that as a developer, as someone, I mean, anybody can go on GitHub, of course, but having the technical background to to really dig into it feels really empowering. So the question was, what brought me to Bitcoin? Yeah, the verifiability. And I met Alex Gladstein at some point while I was in college. We did this social impact panel thing. And he was like, screw banking the unbanked, let's unbank the banked. And that just stuck with me forever. It's being able to, so I think at this point, a lot of people have heard his message in the last, 5 years or so. But it was hugely orange pilling for me to hear about activists raising money using Bitcoin, activists whose bank accounts are being frozen, being able to subvert that using censorship resistant money. That was huge for me.
Coin Stories is proudly brought to you by Bitdeer, a global leader in disruptive technology for Bitcoin mining and AI. As a publicly traded leader, Bitdeer boasts a massive 900 megawatts of operational data center capacity and an additional 1.1 gigawatts under development across 3 continents, positioning Bitdeer as one of the most diversified and power-dense computing companies in the world. Bitdeer's leadership laid the groundwork for the original advancements in Bitcoin mining ASICs. It's really the only company in the industry with the track record and clout to disrupt the market again, with groundbreaking new designs for the next generation of mining ASICs. Now, Bitdeer is leveraging years of expertise in data center and cloud management into high-performance computing through a recently announced partnership with NVIDIA. Join Bitdeer in reshaping the world of Bitcoin mining. Learn more at bitdeer.com and explore how they are pioneering the future today. Yeah, no, I love that. His book, Check Your Financial Privilege, was really, really influential for me to understand the human rights component and the fact that there are so many people who face censorship, financial transactional censorship on a daily basis in different parts of the world, and we really need to focus and highlight some of those issues. So let's get into a little bit of what you do. My audience has a lot of beginners and people who are not technical, and I'm not really technical. So for a while, Bitcoin was extremely intimidating to me. So forgive me if I ask some very, very basic questions, but I think that it'll help just kind of level the playing field for everyone. We'll get on the same page. So what is a Bitcoin Core developer? What do you do on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, and please feel free to interrupt me if I'm under-explaining something. Yeah, so I'm a software developer. I work on Bitcoin Core, and Bitcoin Core is it's a couple things. One, it's the reference implementation. It is software descended from what Satoshi originally published alongside the white paper. The MVP software that you can run to join the Bitcoin network, download blocks, connect to other peers, send out transactions, and sync with the main chain. And so that's mainly what it is. But also in a practical sense, it is how ultimately pretty much everybody interacts with the Bitcoin network, either directly or indirectly. So you might be running a Bitcoin Core node that you maybe downloaded from bitcoincore.org and you use that to be your own bank. Or you could be using some kind of mobile wallet that maybe talks to an exchange, and the exchange is running servers that are running Bitcoin Core, or something that talks to Bitcoin Core. Ultimately, I think 98 to 99% of the nodes on the network are running exactly Bitcoin Core. There's also forks of it and whatnot. So yeah, it's a fully decentralized project. It's open source. The GitHub is Bitcoin/Bitcoin. So anybody is free to contribute. It's, again, public, and there is no like Bitcoin Foundation or Bitcoin Core Inc. that is the company that decides who's hired to work on it, or what the budget is and who gets paid what. And that is really tricky. It's really difficult. It makes things a bit hard, especially in bear markets. But it is a beautiful, messy, and crucial part of how Bitcoin works, is that the development is decentralized. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yes. And you don't work for Bitcoin because it's not a company. Some people ask me, they go, do you work for Bitcoin? I'm like, no. I educate on Bitcoin, but Bitcoin is a protocol. It's open source code. So why does it need to be maintained? And can you talk about sort of the group? Because I understand that you are one of 5 key holders?
Sure. So all software requires maintenance. All software has dependencies. Of course, you need a computer with an operating system in order to run Bitcoin Core. And I guess if you were to think of software as kind of this huge tower of building blocks, typically, Bitcoin Core itself is only a few 100,000 lines of code, but it has like, millions, billions, whatever lines, not that lines of code is a metric, but there's a lot of dependencies. There's a lot of things that need to magically happen in order for this thing to run. And so just from like a plumbing perspective to, get things to fit together, that is a part of maintenance that every piece of software needs to do. Nothing is in a vacuum. But also in the course of, 15 or so years ago, when Satoshi first published the kind of proof of concept code to today, it's evolved so much to be almost unrecognizable.
Really?
Yes. And so just from a security perspective, I'll just put this out there first. Like Bitcoin Core is a very, very security oriented piece of software compared to almost anything else, right? Mm-hmm. Like if it doesn't work properly, you might lose all your money. Or, I don't want to scare anybody, but that, it is a very security piece of software, and it's going to be on this like anonymous peer-to-peer network. And so the threat model is very severe compared to a lot of other applications that you might run on your computer. Mm-hmm. And so that bar of security, which has gotten higher and higher as the prices increase, as there's been more users, that's also something where you actually need to change the code in order to do. It's not just, you wrote, it's, actually, maybe this is a little too serious, but the analogy that I use is like, democracy as we know it. It's not just like you wrote the Constitution once and then you're done. Democracy's fixed. Like we know how to, it's like we see democracy undermined all over the world. If you're following the stolen election in Venezuela, right? There's a lot of, I guess you can call these implementation details that can undermine the design goal that you had, even if you outlined it in a very like kind of in very key ways where you're like, it's a decentralized network, but there's like all kinds of things that, you know, it's not just like, it's going to be decentralized and then it just is, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm explaining this properly.
No, it's absolutely. I mean, there's human action, and there is different interpretations, right? And there have been debates within Bitcoin. If anyone is familiar with block size wars, I don't think that that's the only war we're going to have, right? There's constantly debates about whether we should be financing Bitcoin core development, which I want to ask you about later. But there's a lot of, I mean, this is ultimately people. We are the network. We are running the nodes, right? So I completely understand what you're saying.
Yeah, and it's so important that people run nodes. Like we don't have the properties of Bitcoin, the censorship resistance, the not being state controlled, if all of the nodes are just run by huge enterprises, or all of them are through this infrastructure provider on Microsoft Azure, and, you know, like CrowdStrike pushes an update and all of the nodes go offline, right?
Exactly.
And there's another thing is Bitcoin Core doesn't push auto updates. The node that you run, the software that you chose to start on your laptop or on your Raspberry Pi or whatever it is, that's not going to magically accept updates with new consensus rules or security fixes. Unfortunately, it goes both ways. And so it's going to be at the discretion of the user and the responsibility of the user to continue making sure that they're using a maintained version of the software.
And I just want to encourage people. Again, I'm not technical, but thanks to Sam Callahan and BTC Sessions and the Bitcoin Way, I have been able to run my own node. I have a Raspberry Pi. It made me actually feel really like I felt like I accomplished something when I ran it, and it felt so good when I thought I couldn't do something, and I learned, oh, actually, it's not that intimidating. It took forever to download the whole entire ledger, but that's besides the point. But it felt really empowering and exciting, and there should be more nodes. Can you talk a little bit about, because sometimes I hear people say, oh, well, there are, I don't know, maybe 10,000 nodes around the world. I've heard different numbers, but somewhere in that range, like 5 figures. Is that enough? How secure is the network?
I think that the metric is not necessarily the number of nodes. Like I said, you could have like 1,000 nodes all controlled by one infrastructure provider on AWS 1-East, AWS, you know, Southeast Asia -2, you know, like, and they're all AWS nodes, right? That's not true decentralization either. So I guess,
sorry.
Sorry, the Amazon cloud provider. Yeah. So like, yeah. There are other like blockchains that we'll make fun of because they have like a central infrastructure provider that runs all their nodes for them. And they're like, we have, you know, whatever 1,000 nodes.
Yeah, no,
but
really.
The infra provider will have like a bug, and then they'll have downtime for a few hours. And that's just not, that's not decentralized at all. But yeah, I think 5 figures is the estimate that I understand as well. Not all nodes are publicly reachable.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I think that's accurate.
Can you talk a little bit about the communication between the nodes and the blocks that are actually validated? Because one thing that I think is confusing, especially even for me to explain to newbies, is how that process works, how mining works, how the blocks are added, because there is, you know, everything has to be broadcast. And once a block is found, then people start working off of that block, but sometimes one gets orphaned. And I think that can get very confusing for people who are just coming into this space. How do you explain it to people?
Yeah, so I think we need to like go back to the kind of computer science-y problem that we were trying to solve, which is we have this like decentralized network. It's like if you were watching a football game and there were no referees, it's just everybody in the stands keeps score. And then we have to come to some kind of idea of what the score is. And we're going to do that with our computers that connect to each other in a peer-to-peer way. And so from that sense, you can imagine that people sitting on one side of the stand, as they're trying to like broadcast what they think the score is, people on the other side of the stands might, it takes a while to get to them. And so if they come up with a different score at the same time, it might, and they tell everybody around them, and everyone along that route agrees with the person that told them what the score is, if they start at the same time, you might get 50-50 split or whatever it is, split. Hopefully, I don't know if that's a good analogy. But that is kind of the nature.
So they're getting the information, they're coming to a consensus, but it's almost like a race, right? Whichever one has more consensus first.
Yeah, exactly. And this is a problem that unfortunately it's kind of hard to solve, where you have like you have a decentralized like group of people. Yeah. They might just have a race, right? And they could be ballot blocks. And this is, but I don't know of any, from a computer science perspective, if there is, based on the trade-offs that we've decided to make, I don't know if there's no perfect way, but that's what blocks are for, right? So if at all times everybody was broadcasting transactions, for example, which is what happens on the network, a lot of people, they'll talk about this in terms of unconfirmed payments, where they're like, oh, my payment has not been in a block yet, but I've sent it. Can the merchant give me my coffee or whatever it is? Yeah. And it's like, no, they have to wait for confirmation. And they're like, oh, but like, why can't we come up with a way of like making sure payments go through before the block? I'm like, but that's what blocks are for, is like they are the mechanism through which we have decided consensus happens, but it's still not perfect, or it's not like instantaneously perfect in the time scale that we're imagining, kind of these kinds of payments. But ultimately, you're always going to converge to the same chain, hopefully, as long as everybody can hear everybody.
Okay, well, I'm glad you actually brought that up, because that is also, I think, something that when you're starting to understand Bitcoin gets a little bit confusing, because the network is growing. There's more and more demand. There's only a certain amount of block space. So there's scarcity, not just in the amount of Bitcoin there is, but also in literally what can fit into a block. And so there's a mempool, right? And not, if I have a mempool that I'm looking at, it's not the same as, the person that's in the house next door, and you're in London and you have a different mempool that you're going to see. How do you break that down simply? Because I've sometimes heard, oh, there's 300,000 transactions waiting to be validated, but it's 10-minute blocks. So how do you explain that to people? Because sometimes I'll be asked like, well, if there are 300,000 and I'm in this line, how am I ever going to confirm the transaction? Or is it going to take days to settle? How do you explain that?
I think, it is a little bit confusing. I think a lot of people, when they think of transaction fees in the traditional finance sense, they'll think of it in terms of by volume, so like maybe 1% of the amount that you're sending, because often the scarce thing is liquidity, whereas the scarce thing that you are the scarce resource that you're using up as a transactor on the Bitcoin network is block space. And any like 1,000 bytes of block space can correspond to anywhere from 1 to like, hundreds potentially of people's economic activity. And so I think maybe that is kind of the contrast that a lot of people are not accustomed to if they come from more traditional financial tools. But I guess my only answer to that would probably be like, Bitcoin transactions don't, I think I think a lot of people are using maybe credit card transactions or those kind of like, I hand you some cash kind of payments. They're trying to map that onto their mental model of what Bitcoin is. And maybe that's not quite accurate. And I think we have more language around this where it's like, oh, it's actually for settlement instead of like kind of credit card type Visa type payments. But yeah, so there's to answer your question, I guess there's a backlog of transactions that are waiting to get through, and they're prioritized based on fees, fee rate, because a miner is going to publish a block. It has a limited amount of space. And so again, because that's a scarce resource, the way that you bid for your transaction to go through more is you bid a higher fee rate, a higher fee per bytes that you're using. And that's really annoying. But that's kind of the interface that we have so far. Hopefully we build something a bit more intuitive for users along the way. But But yeah, it means that your transaction might not go through if a lot of other people are trying to transact.
Right.
Hopefully this is helpful.
Well, I think it is again, because once you start understanding just the process of mining and how the transactions actually get in there, and the fact that you should wait for like 6 confirmations, I think that can be a little confusing, and it allows for easy vectors for attack. Right, people on other blockchains that say, "Oh, well, we're faster," blah blah blah, but they don't have the security and decentralization that Bitcoin does, specifically because Satoshi designed it to have a certain block size and so that everyone can run a node, right? But that does mean that as there's more demand, there's going to be a lot more people trying to fit into these blocks. And I think that will make people wonder, how does that impact me day to day? Because they don't want to pay high fees. And it's easier to understand almost Lightning because it's like an open tab, right? You could just go back and forth a million times and then you settle later on the blockchain, versus looking at a mempool that has 300,000 pending transactions going, how is this all going to work and fit in and keep with the 10-minute block time? So sometimes I think it's a little confusing to explain to newcomers. Do you get questions like that?
Yeah. I get a lot of why can't we just increase the block size kind of questions. And so, well, actually, this is a good point because, like I was saying before, running nodes and having this decentralized network, it's not just something you can like command into existence, right? It's not like a line of code that you can write and then it will be decentralized. It's like the culmination is a design goal where you have a lot of technical challenges. And so actually this is very much a concern for us, is the cost and the requirements of running a node. Like you have a node running on your Raspberry Pi, which was hopefully pretty cheap. A Raspberry Pi is like, I don't know, hopefully less than $100. And it's not like eating up your electricity bills every day or month, whatever. And it's not requiring you to be like a tech wizard in order to set up. Like those are all really important technical things that translate into you running a node as someone who like is not a software engineer, right? And so block size is part of the equation of resources to run a node. So today, like, the blockchain is, I think it's like close to 600 gigabytes or something, but the UTXO set size is like in the tens of gigabytes. And this means that like an everyday Raspberry Pi, like regular computers, is able to run a node. But if we were to like 10x the block size or like make the block intervals 10 times faster, and you're processing more transactions on chain, but it undermines this. It puts like a pressure on node runners because it costs so much more. While on the other hand,
it centralizes over time.
Well, on the other hand, like things like Lightning are incentivized to be built when you have really small block sizes, because you have this scarcity that has a pressure towards people to use block space more wisely. It means that exchanges are going to be much more compact so that they can save on fees. It means that Lightning is built and maybe more layers are built. I'll leave it at that.
It's time for a quick break to hear these messages from my partners who make this podcast possible. Next up, Speed Bitcoin Lightning Wallet, one of the fastest growing wallets out there. Speed is a secure, low-cost way to send or receive Bitcoin instantly. It's super simple and scores high user ratings. You can even use it to shop gift cards of your favorite brands and earn rewards. Download Speed using the QR code on the screen or the link in my show notes and use promo code COINSTORIES10 to get 5,000 free sats. Next up, Coinkite. Coinkite makes everything you need to safely self-custody your Bitcoin, including the Coldcard wallet. That's the cold storage device I use for safekeeping my Bitcoin. You can verify the source code, it's ultra secure, and it's easy to use even if you're a beginner. Head to their site in my show notes and get a 5% discount with promo code COINSTORIES. And finally, the why of Bitcoin is easy to grasp, but the how can be so confusing. The Bitcoin Way is a professional Bitcoin IT and security team offering personalized one-on-one support that guides you through cold storage, setting up nodes, inheritance planning, privacy best practices, and more. Don't take my word for it. Take 82-year-old customer Bill's.
Give the Bitcoin Way a try. You will be well on your way to owning and protecting the greatest money ever discovered.
Set up your 30-minute free consultation today. All right, back to the show. Okay, I love that. This is super helpful. I wanted to ask you, I heard you talk at a conference and you were talking about whether or not Bitcoin can be hacked? Like, could a nation state come in and really jam the network and affect our ability to transact? Can you talk more about that? Because when I heard you, I'll be honest, I was a little scared because it sounded like we're not at a place where this is an unhackable nation state resistant technology. Did I understand that correctly?
So that came from a tweet that I read where someone polled, can we withstand a nation state attack? And a lot of people said yes, kind of blindly. And there were, maybe I'm reading too much Twitter, but my intention was not to scare anybody. I think what I was trying to say there is kind of back to like that democracy analogy. We can't just take for granted like what we have today, and we can't just be like, yeah, Satoshi wrote it down, this constitution exists, therefore we're good. Like it's we have to like uphold. There are a lot of ways in which Bitcoin can fail or not succeed to the extent that we hope that it will. And this is not, it's like it's in the form of like regulatory things. It can be in the form of like cultural things, like maybe people just don't like it, all this. And so it's, if Bitcoin succeeds, it'll be because like we all made that happen. Mm-hmm. But there are still problems that we have to solve along the way in order to make that happen. And so the nation state analogy thing, I was talking about kind of software bugs. So we've recently started doing security advisory disclosures where we publicize bugs that have been in older versions of the software. And typically they're hard to pull off. The low-hanging fruit in the past 15 years since Satoshi first published the software was all taken care, like pretty much all taken care of early on. But like as the security bar has gotten higher, you can still kind of find examples of bugs where like if someone has a lot of resources and they're very technologically in tune with, they're able to spot this bug and exploit it. It means, for example, that this node will crash. And why does that matter? It's not, sorry. What I'm going to actually, I should make sure, because I don't want to scare people. We're finding like network level bugs, right? We're not finding like, like the entire cryptographic scheme that we built these things on is like unsafe and actually all the funds are like in danger. That's not the case. It's not like somebody's going to find your private key and steal all your Bitcoins. That's not the bug. The bugs are things like your node might crash if somebody's trying to attack you. And that can be very problematic because if you're relying on your node for your Lightning client, for example, and you go offline and you aren't aware of chain updates, you might lose money. Another example is if people are able to are able to censor blocks. So again, I was talking about like when somebody finds a block, they're going to broadcast it to everybody, and that's good. That's how you hear about what the main chain is, hopefully. However, if somebody's able to prevent you from hearing about the main chain, that's really problematic or they could serve you an alternate chain. That could mean that, in this alternate universe, you did get paid, whereas in the real universe, you didn't. And of course, like kind of network wide, we often see that there's, 20% of nodes that are running a really old version that's vulnerable to something. If there's a mass attack, like that can be really harmful for the network. Or if, if the attacks in the sense of like a node crashes or a node stalls or it takes really long for them to receive and propagate blocks. These are all like really unhealthy for the network. And especially if it affects miners, like it can kind of alter the state of how blocks are produced in that time. And maybe from a software perspective, like if the network, like, if a bunch of nodes crash for a second, like I think that's really bad, but maybe like it actually doesn't mean anything. Maybe all those were all like somebody's hobby, Bitcoin node, and nobody's funds were stolen, but it could be a marketing problem. Or, it could affect, if you're able to successfully attack one node and that's the node that like this exchange uses, that can be really problematic. And so, yeah, I'm not trying to scare anyone. I'm trying to kind of like, just maybe critically think about like when we think about security, it's not it's secure or it's insecure, right? It's what is the threat model that we're dealing with, and how realistic is it for us to be protected against that threat model, and yeah, I'm never trying to like get people to be scared about Bitcoin. I think it's just, we've got work to do, right? And there are certain scaling challenges that if we had not overcome them, we would not be here where we are today, right? And there, I think, are future scaling challenges that we will need to overcome if we want to reach hyper-Bitcoinization of the billions of people using it. And so we shouldn't just like be complacent and be like, yep, we're done. That was never the case, and it shouldn't be the case.
Right. We shouldn't just assume that Bitcoin's going to be inevitable and perfect and there are no security threats. Well, so understanding Bitcoin as deeply as you do and seeing some of the threats that might exist, I mean, on a scale of like 1 to 100, how worried are you that something could pose a real threat to the Bitcoin network? And does that change maybe how you view your own investment thesis? Like, would you put all of your money in there? Because some people do. Some people think I'm going to put everything in here. This is my best shot at saving for the future, versus should maybe people look at it and say, you wouldn't want all your eggs in the basket?
So I think this comes back to the idea of fully verifiability and comparing it with other things. So I know a lot about the threats that Bitcoin faces because I can look at the code. I could not tell you whether I can't give you any kind of judgment of how safe like it is to use my US dollars in Bank of America or Chase. I have no idea. I can't see their code, right? And so I think it's a good sign that having looked at the code and having talked to so many people who I very much respect and worked with people who really know what they're doing security wise, and coming to this conclusion of like, yeah, there are some like medium severity, very hard to pull off things that can put a node in danger, and the impacts on the entire network are not, like being able to like answer that question straight for Bitcoin is because I can look at it. I would guess that a lot of, well, I don't want to be mean, but a lot of like big corporations will often use software that is less, that I would consider less secure, at least to the same standard. And they obviously there are regulatory barriers and all kinds of layers of reasons why and insurance reasons why it might be safe. Bitcoin is one where we signed up to be like, yep, I'm self-custodying, and so you kind of need to be aware of what threat model you're putting yourself in when you're investing. So I would never encourage anyone to be reckless. But again, like my point here is like being able to look at Bitcoin and give like kind of this glowing review of like, oh, maybe we should be worried about nation state attackers, but like it's actually the most amazing piece of software that I've seen, is a glowing review. Okay. Hopefully that gives you confidence.
Let's talk a little bit more about just the Bitcoin Core developers, because I mentioned earlier, I heard you talk with Peter on what Bitcoin did, about how there are 5 of you that can sort of submit the changes, or you have the ability, you have the key. Can you talk a little bit more about that, and how we control for maybe the risks that exist there, that someone might introduce something that could be harmful to the network? And then we'll talk a little bit about financing Bitcoin Core development.
Sure, yeah. The status quo with open source software projects is typically that some really smart person found a problem and then like coded up the solution, and then other people are like, oh, awesome, that solves my problem, I'm going to use it. And then before you know it, it has like thousands or millions of users, and it was just like some person like wrote this up, and that person is the maintainer of their project. They own the code that they wrote, and even if it's open source and other people can contribute, typically there's like that dictator, not dictator, but like the person who wrote it and is now unfortunately responsible for like this thing that millions of people are using. There's a lot of stories that are like this, and oftentimes the maintainers don't get paid. So I'm giving that to contrast with Bitcoin, where because people think they think of the number 5, there are 5 maintainers for Bitcoin Core, and they're like, oh, so it's only 5, but like that's 5 times more than what oftentimes happens with open source projects that a lot of people use. So yeah, like we have the sense of maintainership, which is being able to have write access to the place where the code is stored. So people, when they open a pull request, it means that they open a proposal for the code changes that they want to make. They're like, I want to add this feature, or I want to rename this thing, or I want to add tests for this, etc. And anybody can open this request and anybody can review it. But one of 5 people are going to be able to actually push the button to put that in. And we have keys that are in this public place. All of this is public, by the way. Anybody can view it. There's absolutely nothing that we can do that is private, and absolutely nothing that we can do that is not totally verifiable by you, which is awesome, and you should do it. But yeah, ultimately 5 people have a key. And this doesn't mean that I have the ability to merge as in incorporate changes, accept changes. I don't have the ability to do something that everybody disagrees with, because if I were to do that, it would just be reverted, and then I'd probably have my key revoked. And typically when we are adding changes, we'll do that over the course, every day there'll be changes made. And then every 6 months, we'll release a new version of Bitcoin Core that has those changes. So even if, I did something evil, like there would be months of time for someone to find out that had happened, right, flag it, revert it, blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, after we release the software, people have to choose to run it. So hopefully that gives people peace of mind.
Well, and so the core developers are financed through a lot of grants, right? And people donate. And I've seen that there has been a controversy lately, and I want to better understand it. I would love to get your take on it, because one thing that I've heard that I found sort of like an interesting question was, actually, let me back up. Let's talk about work reviews, right? People who have worked in corporations, they get their annual review or mid-year review, and they always find something wrong. You could be the best employee ever, but they have to give you something to improve on, right? Otherwise, you never have a review where someone's like, oh, you did absolutely perfect, walk away. You're good. There's always something that they'll find, they'll nitpick. So is there a sense where if you get hired, or if you are financed to look at and maintain this code, that you sort of feel pressure to find something to do, to tinker with, to change, to improve upon? Isn't that kind of almost like a human incentive? Otherwise you feel like, well, if I've contributed nothing and I just say everything's great, I haven't done my job.
I kind of get what you're saying. And okay, I've seen this argument. So I think my first answer to that is there's so much work to do that is not tinkering and just like work for work's sake. But I think the point of there maybe being perverse incentives sometimes with certain types of grants being not great. It's very similar to academia, where people on grants are, they often feel pressure from the grant giver to like do a feature of some sort. I think that people often think of development as consensus related, like, changing the way that, the money rules are. But there's so much more than that in Bitcoin Core. The networking protocol, I think, is the most interesting and actively developed place. But there's also wallet things. There's like interfaces. There are all kinds of things that have absolutely nothing to do with what the consensus validation rules are. And I would say that I wouldn't be able to point to someone right now who is paid full time to just tinker with consensus. and I think so. I might as well. So I work for Brink, which is a nonprofit that collects donations from the community, and then has a grant committee to decide who to give full-time employment contracts to. And we focus mostly on security and maintenance. And I wouldn't say that we'd outright just reject someone for working on consensus, but the process of evaluating grant applications and applications, it is very much not like, what's the feature that they're proposing they're going to shoehorn into this piece of software. That is like almost the opposite of what we're interested in, which is why we fund people to work on really boring things like maintenance and adding tests and writing up security advisories and making sure that the lights stay on, because there is an endless amount of that kind of work to do. I think we need more people, and we need to fund more people doing that work. And I completely agree that we shouldn't be giving out grants to people just because they came up with this sexy new feature that may or may not be cool, right, or because they have this consensus proposal that would enable like blah, 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 blah on Bitcoin. Right. I think that I agree that that's not at all how we should be funding development. However, I think it requires people to think critically, which is why I think it's really important that things like Brink exist, and I'm really grateful that they support my work. And I wouldn't be as happy to be looking at grants day to day. So, wow. Hopefully that's like a nuanced answer to that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Well, since you guys are focused on security, can you talk about any threats that exist with AI? Some people are worried that these ultra powerful machine learning computers can kind of crack Bitcoin. Is that possible?
I'm not worried about that, I don't think. I'd probably say like,
and let's say if they can break SHA-256, in theory, we could fork and make it even more complicated, right? And if they were to break encryption, they would basically break everything on the internet. Is that sort of the logic? Am I understanding?
So I think I'm not too worried about the AI kind of angle to this. I don't think AI is very well suited for these kinds of problems if you're trying to break SHA-256. I think people sometimes worry about quantum computers, and I think that concern is maybe a little bit more interesting on this time scale of like 30 to 50 years. Okay. Not like tomorrow. But there are people thinking about this, and it's I think if people were more concerned, you would see more about it. My understanding is like quantum wise, because you're thinking of the threat as like 30 to 50 year kind of scale. And there's a lot of active research being done like every year. Like it gets extreme, like a lot better significantly. And so I've heard of kind of quantum secure signature schemes being like kind of POC'd for Bitcoin, where they're like, yeah, we can do it, but the signature size is going to be like 1,000 something bytes, as opposed to like 30 something today. And so like, that's pretty, like we were talking about block space, right? Like that kind of sucks. And if this is only going to be applicable 20 to 30 years or 30 to 50 years from now, we can benefit from another 20 years worth of research to make this a lot more optimized and a lot more usable and suitable for our use case. And so, yeah, like, I guess all I'm trying to say is like the concerns that you've voiced and that, you know, are probably coming from somewhere, like people think about them, but they have a very like practical and like thoughtful approach to how to deal with those kinds of concerns.
So do you believe that Bitcoin will be the monetary standard? I mean, decades from now, I know that we all of us interact so much with our fiat currencies still, and the two worlds will assimilate, I think, more and more. But do you see us ever just completely just being on a Bitcoin standard?
I can envision it for sure. I think I'm not in the business of speculating about Bitcoin. I think we should all be in the business of making Bitcoin what we want it to be. And, development is one way to do that. Educating people about it is one way to do that. There are so many things that are required to make Bitcoin this reality that you just described, and we all want it to happen. But like, it's all equally our responsibility to make it happen, right? Like, for example, I wasn't hired to be software engineer level 3 of Bitcoin. And, you were saying how, you weren't hired to be Bitcoin spokesperson. But like, nobody's going to be, and we picked hard mode where it's decentralized and it's harder to do things in a decentralized way, but it means that we have to do it.
Is there anything that keeps you up at night? I mean, when we were talking about some of the risks and the idea that there could be some problem that maybe we're not even thinking of, is there anything that you worry about, that you think that people should be a little bit more aware of?
I worry about people's perception of Bitcoin Core. I kind of started doing more like interviews basically because I think people have a really skewed view of what the community looks like. Like any decentralized community, we didn't hire a spokesperson to speak on behalf of Bitcoin Core, and developers tend to be really introverted and not do interviews. And so what you end up getting is kind of the really loud and really missionary types, or the people who are LARPing or grifting or trying to get money, speaking on behalf of Bitcoin Core. And I think there are some really harmful messages out there about what it is that we do and how much work needs to be done on the software. So yeah, what keeps me up at night is people forgetting that this thing runs on open source software, and decentralized networks are hard to maintain, and everybody has a role to play in it. And I think demonizing and administering kind of purity tests to developers and kind of depriving funding from them or letting them face legal risks, things like that are going to harm ultimately the vision that we have planned for our wonderful decentralized network. So hopefully people take away from this that developers are normal people and they're trying to do good for Bitcoin, and we need more of y'all. So yeah, we're normal people.
Well, I think people love listening to you talk about this, and it's really inspiring. And the fact that you're a woman, I think, is exciting too. Do you ever just zoom out and think, oh my gosh, this is just an incredible piece of technology, and how did Satoshi come up with this? Who is Satoshi? Like, how often do you think about Satoshi?
As you may have heard, my dog's name is Toshi. I think so. I think it's important not to kind of just take a lot of Satoshi's things as like prophet, like gospel, because Satoshi made mistakes. Satoshi wrote bugs. One of the things that we disclosed recently was a Satoshi bug. And this is not to knock on Satoshi. Again, I'm like, this is like one of the most important people in my life, right? Yeah. Like things have evolved, right? The vision that was set out there is a vision. It's an abstract concept. It's something that we all have a role to play in maintaining and building and evolving from like 2010 Bitcoin to 2020 era Bitcoin. Now there's ETFs and there's all these users all around the world. Like, it's an amazing new future. And there's going to be more eras. We're going to look back on this day and be like, oh, that, they didn't know what they're, like the stakes are getting higher and higher, and Bitcoin has changed so much. Like 10 years ago, I don't know that anybody was talking about Bitcoin's role in terms of demand side flexibility from an energy perspective. And now that's like the hot topic of today. And it's huge, right? It started out just as this kind of cypherpunk idea of internet money, and it's evolved a lot since then in really great ways. And Bitcoin means something different to everybody. But we found ourselves disagreeing with Satoshi in certain kind of implementation details. And I think that's okay. Wow. And I don't know. I think people, So I think if you were to say something and then somebody were like, oh, but in 2010, Bitcoin talk forum, Satoshi said blah, blah, blah. I think you want to take that with a grain of salt, because it was a human being who made this thing that is now Bitcoin as we know it today. I don't know.
It's incredible to think about it as. I think some of the history is fascinating, and I love looking at the archives, and yet that no matter who it is, it doesn't matter really at this point, because some people are so scared, like, what if it was the CIA? All right, but as we start to wrap up, I did want to ask you, do you think that we're going to go through another block size war or something equivalent to that? And what do you think it would be if we do?
Ooh, that's a good question. And I don't want to start a Bitcoin war. It does feel like there's a lot of pressures around soft forks nowadays. I don't want it to become that big of a conflict, and I don't want it to cause splits in the community, because that's not helpful. But I think a lot of language around development, I think a lot of people are kind of treating code review as like political lobbying sometimes. And I think Bitcoin Core is the most meritocratic organization of people that I've ever seen in my life. And that's really, really special. And that's something that's also something that you have to maintain over time, and can be undermined by people kind of trying to form like lobbying groups, or just simply spamming people and harassing people, and causing people to have post paralysis. Like, I often find myself not being quite comfortable to post like my opinion to like the Twitter type people who come on to Bitcoin and not Bitcoin, to GitHub, to register their demands for how mempool policy should be, for example. And sometimes they'll use very kind of resource intensive ways of submitting their opinions. And that, I think, is really taxing on development, and it soaks up a lot of resources and time. Anyway, how did we get here?
Sorry, so Gloria had to move rooms, but we're just getting back into it. Okay, so do you anticipate some other kind of war between Bitcoiners over something to do with the ultimate core of the network?
So I would hope that we never get to that. I think there are so many ways that we can resolve differences in how people feel about what the consensus rules should be, before resorting to kind of a community splitting kind of event like that. I would caution people from kind of making split decisions about very technical things on face value of like kind of the ideological things that are attached to certain proposals, right? I think seeking nuance is always really important, and seeking to understand better is extremely important for something so technical. And there's always like a grain of truth to whatever it is that people are saying. But I think always remember that Bitcoin's fully verifiable. We're not politicians. People like to kind of, maybe they're just conspiracy theorizing and love to kind of think like, oh, the people with the power are making decisions on behalf of us, and, they're not to be trusted. Well, it's all like code that you can view publicly on GitHub. And so like, don't be so quick to just assume that people with power, I don't know what kind of power exactly they would have, are trying to screw you over. I think sometimes I see that a lot in Bitcoin, which I think is admirable to kind of question the status quo. However, like, do remember that people who build Bitcoin, people who are developers on Bitcoin Core, they're here because they care and they want to make Bitcoin better, and they're doing it fully in public. So just remember that.
Yeah, no, I love that message. It's been awesome to talk to you. I know we're out of time, but any just final thoughts as we wrap up?
Yeah, I think that about covers it. Thank you so much for having me. Bitcoin means a lot to me. I'm so grateful to be doing this for a living. And I can't wait to see what's going to happen to Bitcoin. And I hope we all know that we have a role to play in it.
Well, I've loved talking to you. I hope to have you back on again. And I hope that people get out of this that you can learn even the technical components. It just takes a little bit of time and someone to walk you through it and explain it in a simple way. And when you do learn the technical components of Bitcoin and the programming, I think you just get so much more excited. And it really, truly is this revolutionary, brilliant, intelligent, oddly simple but complicated, I mean, piece of technology and code and protocol that I think is incredible and can do so many things on a global scale. So I get really excited by it. I hope to learn more. I'm always learning. And thank you so much for being a resource. Where can people find you?
I'm on Twitter as Glozzow, GLOZOW. I'm on GitHub at the same handle. And please visit brink.dev. That's the organization that sponsors me. And if you're interested in learning more technical topics, bitcoinops.org publishes a weekly newsletter and has an index of all technical topics. And it's a really, really great way to learn about anything that you're interested in within Bitcoin Core, within Bitcoin.
Perfect. Love that. Thank you so much, Gloria. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for checking out this episode of Coin Stories. If you're listening on the Fountain app, you can show your support and share your thoughts by sending a boost. One of last month's top episodes was with Jeff Booth. At Phase and Hodl boosted 2021 sats and said, Booth once again provides perspective to help see through the matrix and a hopeful path forward. The man is onto something, and we need 1,000 more that can communicate like him. I agree. I love reading and replying to your boosts, so download Fountain on iOS or Android today, and make sure you subscribe to Coin Stories. This show is for entertainment and educational purposes only. Nothing should constitute as official investment advice, and you should always do your own research. My inbox is open. If you want to share feedback or guest suggestions, just reach out at natalie@talkingbitcoin.com. Make sure you're subscribed to the show and check out my free newsletter, nataliebrunel.substack.com. I'll see you next time.